x squared minus 16x plus blank equals parentheses squared. You'll have a few examples like this, and basically what you're going to want to do in order to figure out what goes in this first blank, we're going to have then square this number in front of x. So we're going to have it, and that just means you're going to divide it by 2. So negative 16 divided by 2, that's the halving part. And that'll give you negative 8. Then you want to square it. Negative 8 squared, if we were to square that, negative 8 times negative 8 is 64. That's actually the number that's going to go in that blank there. And then on the other side, in the parentheses, basically what you're doing is you're just factoring this trinomial that we've got here. And just to give you a little shortcut, what you can do is this is just going to be x and then whatever number that was when it was halved. So the half part is going to go over here. And since that's negative 8, we'll put that there. So 64 and then x minus 8 in the parentheses. Number 2, x squared plus x plus blank equals parentheses squared again. Not going to see very many of these, but just a couple examples here at the start of this lesson. So to figure out what goes in the blank, we're going to have then square the number that goes in front of x. The number in front of x here, the coefficient of x is 1. So we want to have then square it. So halving it by dividing it by 2, and then squaring it is 1 over 4. So basically 1 squared, let me write this a different way. Basically when you're doing fractions, you're just going to square the top, square the bottom. So you end up with 1 squared over 2 squared, which is 4. Okay, so this 1/4 goes up in that spot there. And then this positive 1/2, so you can have x and then positive 1/2 in that box there. And that's it for that one. Number 3, complete the square of x squared plus 8x minus 3 equals 0. Going to go through these 5 steps here. Divide everything by the coefficient of x squared. That's our first step. The coefficient of x squared is just 1. So in this case, you could divide everything by 1, but that's not going to change anything. So actually, on this example, and on a lot of these, where you have 1 in front of x squared, there's not anything you're going to need to do on that first step. Then we move on to number 2, isolate the x squared and the x terms, which means on the left side, we want to get those by themselves. So we need to get rid of this negative 3. So we're going to add it. I'm going to leave a little bit of room, and then it equals 3. And then the next step, we want to have then square the coefficient of x. This is the same thing that we did just a little while ago on examples 1 and examples 2. Basically, you're going to have then square that. The number that's in front of x. So half of it, you're just going to divide by 2. 8 over 2 is 4. Then you want to square it. That's 16. So we're going to be adding 16 to both sides of the equation. So add to both sides. So adding the 16. So on the left, we've got x squared plus 8x plus 16 equals 19. And then what you want to do is, what we would normally do is factor this. I'll go ahead and go through the lengthier way to do this, where you just factor it. You've got x and x, got plus and plus. We need 2 things that multiply to be 16 and add to 8. So that's going to be 4 and 4. And the nice thing about x plus 4 equals 19, is you can write this as x plus 4 squared equals 19. And anytime you've got a parentheses squared or some term squared on the left equal to some number on the right, you can, this was the lesson we just did previous to this, you can square root the left and the right. And by the way, back to the square root property, remember from the previous section that you'll need to put a plus and the minus for your answer on the next step. So the 2 and the square root cancel each other out. You've got x plus 4 equals plus or minus the square root of 19. Look in there for a square. So that would be 1 squared, 2 squared, 3 squared, 4 squared. See if any of those go in. 16 doesn't go into 19. 9 doesn't go into 19. 4 doesn't. So not going to be able to simplify that radical. All we'll want to do next is just get that x by itself. So we're going to subtract 4, and then you're going to put that in front of the plus minus. So x equals negative 4 plus or minus the square root of 19. Number 4, going through the same steps, we're asked to complete the square. We've got y squared plus 5y plus 11 equals 0. First step, divide everything by the coefficient of x squared, or in this case, y squared. We've got a 1 in front, so dividing everything by 1 wouldn't really make a difference. The only time you're really going to do anything on number 1 is if you've got a 2 or 3 or some non-1 number in front of y squared. So skipping that first step. Second step, we want to isolate x squared and the x terms. In this case, that's y squared and the y term. So we want to get rid of the 11. Subtract it. Okay, I left a little bit of room. We're going to halve then square this. So 5 divided by 2. So that's halving it. Then we want to square what we've got there. Remember, on top we're going to square it. On bottom we're going to square it. So 5 squared, 2 squared, and that's the number that we're going to add to both sides, 25 over 4. So ultimately we're going to have a trinomial on the left. So y squared plus 5y plus 25 over 4. But there's a little bit of a shortcut that you can do. Ultimately, that would have factored into some binomial that would have been identical. And in this case, you're going to have y and then plus whatever the halved version was. That's what's going to be inside that parentheses. And on the right side, you'll just need to add the things that we had on the right. So if you want to do a little bit of scratch work, negative 11 plus 25 over 4. The only thing that's tricky about that is you're adding fractions. You need to have the same denominator. Helps to know that there's a 1 on top of the 11, or on bottom of the 11. Your common denominator is going to be 4, since 1 goes into 4. Of course, 4 goes into 4. So this first fraction, the negative 11 over 1, that's the one that needs to change. So in order to get its denominator to be 4, we have to multiply 4 on bottom, and we'll end up needing to do that on top also. So just doing a little bit of scratch work, we've got negative 44 now over 4 plus 25 over 4. And when you add those, you get negative 19 over 4. Negative 19 over 4. And then, so I'm just going to rewrite this a little bit cleaner. Y plus 5 over 2 squared equals negative 19 over 4. And when you've got a parentheses squared on the left, some number on the right, you want to square root. And what that's going to do is it's going to get rid of the squared there. Don't forget your plus minus anytime you do this. Okay, so a couple things we can do on the right side. Y plus 5 over 2 equals plus or minus. So if we make this square root of negative 19, on the bottom we make it square root of 4. There's a little bit of simplifying that we can do. The square root of 4 on bottom, that's just 2. Square root of 4 is 2. So I'm just going to rewrite the left, and then we'll do some simplifying on the right. So 2 on the bottom. Also on top, you'll notice that you've got a negative inside of a square root. Anytime you've got a negative inside, you'll want to take out an I. You could put the I out front and make this square root of 19. Although I might suggest putting the I out to the right, since that's typically how they'll want you to put it in your final answer. So put the I out to the right. Be careful, it's not underneath the square root sign. It's actually outside of the square root sign, off to the right. So once you've done those simplifying steps, you'll just want to get y by itself. So we'll subtract this 5 over 2. Make sure you put that in front of the plus minus. So we've got y equals negative 5 over 2 plus or minus square root of 19 over 2i. Number 5, 3x squared minus 30x equals negative 3. Going to go through these steps. Divide everything by the coefficient of x squared. Most of the time, there's no coefficient in front of x squared really to do anything with, but here we've got a 3. So we're going to divide everything by that 3. And then ultimately we end up with x squared minus 10x equals negative 1. So first step done, then we're moving on to number 2. Isolate the x squared and x terms. Here we've got the x squared term on the left, the x term on the left. They're all by themselves, so we don't have to do anything on that step. Have then square the coefficient of x. So if we have that, I'll just go ahead and shortcut this. You're going to end up ultimately with some parentheses squared equals some number on the right, and inside the parentheses you're going to have x and then halved version of it, which would be negative 10 over 2, which would just be 5. And then if you square that, that's the number that you're going to be adding to the 1. Halved and squared. So really we're adding this to the left, we're adding it to the right, but this is a little bit of a shortcut. And then on the right, we've got 24 now. So I'm just going to write this a little cleaner. X minus 5 squared equals 24. And in order to get the x all by itself, we've got to get rid of the 2. We'll have to get rid of the negative 5. We'll start off by getting rid of the squared part. Square root both sides. So we've got x minus 5 equals plus or minus square root of 24. So we've seen square root of 19 so far. We looked for squares in it. We didn't find any. Here, we do want to look for squares. You know, if this was a square root of 25, we could just write 5. That's pretty easy. Square root of 36, we could just make it 6. Square root of 24, you have to simplify a little bit different than that. So you're going to look for squares: 1 squared, 2 squared, 3 squared, 4 squared. Oops. And you just want to check to see if any of those are factors of 24. 16, not a factor of 24. 9, not a factor of 24, but 4 is. So this 24, I'm going to rewrite this whole thing and just change what's underneath that radical. So we know that 4 goes in. I'm going to rewrite 24 as 4 times 6. And the square root of 4 part, that's actually 2. Square root of 4 is 2. So I'm going to simplify it a little bit more. X minus 5 equals plus or minus 2. And then the square root of 6. 6 had to stay inside that radical. And then your last step is just getting that x by itself. So we're going to add 5. And make sure to put that in front of the plus minus. So negative 5 plus 5 is gone. We've got 5 plus or minus 2 square root of 6. And be careful here that you don't put the 5 and the 2 together and make 7 square root of 6. These are not like terms. 5 plus or minus 2 would be like terms, but 5 plus or minus 2 square root of 6, those aren't things you can combine into one. So this is actually as far as we can go in simplifying this one.